Hi, everybody. I'm Kathrin Koslicki, and I'm here with my colleague, Olivier Massin. We're both at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Neuchâtel. And we're going to present to you a co-authored paper called A Plea for Descriptive Social Ontology. So our project consists in defending the following three claims. Thesis one is that there's basically two different kinds of projects in social ontology. One is a descriptive project, and the other one is a foundational project. And we'll explain what these two different types of projects are. Thesis two is that the descriptive project is actually prior to the foundational project in the order of inquiry. And thirdly, we want to defend the claim that an essentialist framework is best suited for the development of an adequate descriptive approach in social ontology. So here's the plan for our brief talk. First, we're going to describe to you the distinction between the descriptive and the foundational project by means of an analogy, taking the example of descriptive psychology versus philosophy of mind. Secondly, we're going to use the distinction between the descriptive and the foundational project as it's been developed by some people in general metaphysics. Thirdly, we're going to apply the distinction to social ontology. And then at the end, we're going to address some objections and give some replies to them. Okay, Olivier.
Thanks, Kathrin. So let us start by an analogy between two ways of studying the mind from the point of view of philosophy, namely descriptive psychology on the one hand and philosophy of mind on the other. Can you move to the next slide, Kathrin? Good, thanks. There have been two traditions within the 20th century in philosophy, two main traditions, especially in philosophy of mind. And those familiar with those two traditions in philosophy are often struck by the following contrast. So in philosophy of mind, one focal point or problem when investigating the mind has been the mind-body problem, the question of explaining the relation of the mind to the brain. By contrast, within the phenomenological tradition, which we call here descriptive psychology, namely the tradition of Brentano, Meinung, Stumpf, Reinach, Husserl, Scheller, and others, philosophers are virtually silent about the mind-body problem. And in fact, they are deliberately silent about that problem. Here is Brentano: descriptive psychology will therefore, even in its highest states of perfection, never mention a physico-chemical process in any of its doctrines. And Reinach: descriptive psychology is that discipline which strives to take an inventory of consciousness. Descriptive psychology's aim is not to explain and to reduce to other things. Can you? Good. So now the question is, what's the relation between those two endeavors? And here we want to put forward the following claim. In fact, there is no incompatibility between these two attempts, but rather there is a strong complementarity between those two approaches. And our idea is the following. Descriptive psychology, when it is properly done, help fixing the explanandum, what is to be explained, while philosophy of mind precisely takes its explanandum from descriptive psychology. So we need to understand what mental phenomena are or seems to be in order to tackle the question of how to explain their relation to the brain. So to be a bit more specific here, descriptive psychology is a descriptive project which aims at capturing mental phenomena as they appear to us by making explicit the various distinctions, relations, and commonality that they exhibit. Philosophy of mind, on the other hand, is a foundational project. it aims at explaining mental phenomena, in particular the relation between the mental and the physical, by appealing to relations such as identity, realizability, reduction, grounding relation, which are not necessarily readily apparent to us. So if this picture is correct, one consequence of it is that descriptive psychology is prior in the order of inquiry, meaning that we need first to describe clearly what we want to explain before attempting to explaining it. Now, if we subscribe to that picture, there is one important fallacy we should beware of, which we call here the explanatory fallacy. The explanatory fallacy is the fallacy of letting explanatory considerations influence descriptions of mental states. So basically, explanants should fit the explanandum and not the reverse. So if we end up describing phenomena, mental phenomena here, in a certain way because it paves the way for our favorite explanation, then we are guilty of the explanatory fallacy. For instance, if you describe desires in functional terms, not because this is the way desires appears to you, but because you think that functionalism is a promising answer to the mind-body problem, then this is a version of the explanatory fallacy.
Okay, so now we're gonna talk a little bit about how the descriptive versus foundational distinction has already been made by some other philosophers in general metaphysics. And so there is a precedent for this distinction that we're appealing to. For example, Aristotle has the maxim of trying to save the appearances as much as possible. There is also a precedent in Wittgenstein and ordinary language philosophers influenced by Wittgenstein. There is Strawson's well-known distinction between descriptive and revisionary metaphysics. And then in more recent work by Kit Fine, he draws the distinction between naive and foundational metaphysics. We don't, unfortunately, have time right now to go into all of these, but just to remind you that according to Strawson, descriptive metaphysics is content to describe the actual content of our thought about the world, whereas revisionary metaphysics is concerned to produce a better structure, and he says this in Individuals. So while ordinary language philosophers see descriptions as targeting ordinary linguistic practices, Strawson views descriptions as bearing on our conceptual scheme. Now, Kit Fine, in his 2017 article, Naïve Metaphysics, draws a distinction between naive and foundational metaphysics. And according to him, both naive and foundational metaphysics are concerned with the nature of things. So there's this kind of essentialist commitment that we're going to talk about a little bit more shortly. By contrast to language or the structure of our thought. So for Kit Fine, unlike for Strawson, the naive foundational distinction isn't to be understood in terms of something that concerns our language or the structure of our thought. He thinks that naive metaphysics in certain respects is prior to foundational metaphysics. Naive metaphysics proceeds by being directed towards the appearances, that is, the world as it presents itself to us, while foundational metaphysics tries to discern the reality that lies behind these appearances. He thinks that naive metaphysics can be pursued more or less independently from foundational metaphysics, and we should not understand naive as ordinary or pre-philosophical as contrasting with what's philosophical, on the other hand, since he does not think that a clear distinction can be drawn between what is and isn't philosophical. So just to illustrate how we're understanding this contrast a little bit more, so foundational metaphysics has as its aim to produce explanations, and therefore it's bound by whatever constraints we think good explanations should be bound by. So, for example, you might think parsimony is a general constraint that explanations should meet. The fewer the explanantia, the better. Or powerfulness, the more explananda are explained, the better. To come up with a good explanation is going to take ingenuity. So it's the kind of skill that, for example, might require combinatorial ability, the ability to construct or produce a system with few building blocks. On the other hand, descriptive metaphysics aims at producing descriptions, as the name says. And these, for a description to be good, it has to be, for example, adequate. That is, it has to fit the appearances. It has to be exhaustive in the sense that it has to capture all of the distinctions and relations that a keen observer can notice when they're presented with the world as it appears to them. But for example, something like parsimony wouldn't really be a guiding constraint for the descriptive project. So instead of this ability to build something out of few building blocks, then to be a good describer, for example, takes skills like acuity, keenness of observation, sharpness, the ability to notice fine distinctions, and so forth. So these two different projects are going to be governed by different criteria and require different kinds of skills from those who are engaged in them.
So now that we have introduced that distinction between descriptive and foundational project, we would like to apply that distinction to the field that is of interest to us within the context of that conference, namely social ontology. So we propose to capture the distinction in the following way. Descriptive social ontology aims at describing the social world as it appears to us, and by contrast, foundational social ontology aims at explaining those social appearances. And there are many ways in which we can explain social appearances. First, we can rely on many different explanatory relations. We can reduce social appearances. We can ground them. We can argue that they are realized in some other fact. And we can also propose different explanation by relying on different explanations. So we can say, we can, for instance, try to reduce social phenomena to individual phenomena, or we can try to reduce social phenomena to individual and physical phenomena. Or we can more modestly, but importantly as well, try to reduce some social phenomena to some more basic social phenomena. So these are all different ways of practicing foundational social ontology. Now, our impression is that within recent analytic social ontology, foundational social ontology has been the dominant theoretical endeavors. So we just mentioned here three prominent and influential examples. So Searle's social ontology is clearly a foundational social ontology. So from the very start, Searle aims at giving a naturalist account of institutional facts, and he tried to do so by grounding social facts in collective intentionality. So he tried to explain what institutional facts really are in a way that is compatible with naturalism. Guala and Hendricks have proposed a very detailed account of institution in terms of game theoretic terms. So institutions, they say, are rules in equilibria. Here again, they do not just describe institutions as they appear to us, but they give a substantial explanation and some more surprising explanation. This is not what strikes us when we look at the institution thing, but in fact, institutions are rules in equilibria. Another kind of influential foundational account within social ontology has been the approach of Margaret Gilbert. Margaret Gilbert has proposed analysis of various social phenomena, such as promises, in terms of some more basic social phenomena, which she called joint commitments. In all those cases, we start from a phenomena, but the goal is not to describe that phenomena, but to explain it in terms of more basic, more fundamental elements. So now, what is descriptive social ontology? Here again, a bit like with philosophy of mind and in some respects in metaphysics, we have to look a bit outside the analytic philosophy to find the clearest attempts at developing descriptive social ontology. So 3 important precursors here among early phenomenologists are Adolf Reinach, who developed a descriptive account of speech acts such as promising, ordering, granting, submitting, and many other and of legal phenomena such as ownership, rights, obligation, or legal representation. Max Scheler, on the other hand, developed descriptive accounts of varieties of social unities, herds, communities, societies, collective person. And relying on both the account of Reinach and Scheler, Heidenstein has proposed a detailed account, descriptive account of the nature of the states in terms of the sovereignty of the states, and has tried to explain how the state can act, in particular how a state can enact different laws. So now, these are all very fruitful attempts, or so we think, but there is a problem here which one may raise from the start, which is the following. Speaking of appearances makes intuitive sense when we are in the realm of the philosophy of mind. Here we have perception, we have emotions, we have introspection, we have consciousness. So appearances can be defined in terms of those various mental acts. But what are really social appearances? Does that make sense to speak about social appearances and therefore to describe them? Here we have a kind of evading answer. We do not really know what the answer is, but our impression is that there is a bunch of truths or claims which seems to us to be highly plausible and on which we may agree prior to giving any explanation. So here is a list among many other of such claims. The first claim is the first 2 ones are very uninformative, but I think we can agree on them prior to giving any explanation. A city is not a duck, and inflation cannot laugh. These are not the most informative ones. So let us move to more substantive claims. Revolutions, tournaments, economic crises are social episodes, by contrast to social substances, for instance. Ownership is a relation that has at least 2 places between a person and a thing. Promises generate claims and obligations. A claim ceases to exist when its content is realized. Property rights can be transferred. Now, descriptive claims are often draw distinctions. So goods can be owned, services cannot be owned. Another example here, some social phenomena have members, teams, families, societies, others don't, money, constitution, wars. Among social phenomena that have no members, some have participants, such as wars, meetings, or tennis games, but some others have no participants, such as money, positive law, or sewage systems. Another claim again, there are different kinds of social groups and there are different kinds of social glues, and perhaps different glues give rise to different kinds of group. Families perhaps arise from common ancestry. Emotional contagion may help us to define masses. Sympathy may help us to define communities. Contract may help us to define societies. These are all claims that have been made by Max Scheler. And our last example here, one can renounce the claim, but one cannot renounce an obligation. We are not claiming that all of these claims are uncontroversial, but the only claim is that these are not explanatory claims. These are seems to us, and we hope to many of you as well, to be true, and of which we may ask how it is that this is so. Is it really so, and what explains that such fact obtains? And at this point, we want to press perhaps the key idea of this talk, which is that it's very important to take seriously that task of describing appearances, including describing social appearances. The former list of claims may sound a bit boring or a bit trivial, but often missing such claims may lead to making mistakes or overlooking distinctions when we move to the foundational project of explaining social appearances. So to go back quickly to the three examples we mentioned, one famous problem which has been raised against Searle's account of social phenomena is its overlooking the distinction between intended and non-intended social phenomena. Traffic jam, pollution, economic crises are non-intended social phenomena, and trying to ground them in collective intentionality, as Searle does, is kind of problematic. On the other hand, if we start by the descriptive task of describing what we want to explain, the fact that there is a distinction between intentional and non-intentional social phenomena should be readily apparent. Guala and Hendricks wants to explain institution, but if we embark in the descriptive project of making clear what an institution is before trying to explain why it is so, then one clear distinction here is that there are two senses of institution. Institution can be used in the sense of what institutes, like the rules that institute a certain games, or institution can be used as what is instituted, the game that is instituted by the rules, or money, for instance. And perhaps Guala and Hendricks, when they say, for instance, that money is an institution in the sense of a rule in equilibria, perhaps they equivocate between those two senses of institution. And likewise, Gilbert has been developing a whole and very promising and interesting program of explaining many social phenomena in terms of joint commitment, explaining promises in terms of joint commitment. But perhaps she's overlooking, and we just allude to that here, this is not an objection. An objection would require far more than we can say here. But perhaps she tends to overlook the distinction between the author of the promise, the promisor, and all the people taking part in the promise, which are namely the promisor and the promisee. Because when she says that to promise is to jointly commit, she appears to say that both the promisor and the promisee are the author of the promise, which clashes with our description of what a promise here is.
Okay. So in the longer version of this paper, we're going to take up two different objections and present our replies to them. And the first objection asks why we should interpret the descriptive project in social ontology as carrying with it essentialist commitments. And the second objection, which we're calling the triviality objection, asks whether descriptive social ontology isn't going to be easy and something that can't really be expected to reveal valuable insights. So very quickly, because we're already a little bit over time, the first objection asks why we should think of the descriptive project as carrying with it essentialist commitments. And here we want to put forward what we're calling a version of essentialism that's very minimal, and it takes its inspiration from the way in which natures or essences function as giving us minimal dialectical presuppositions in the context of a Socratic dialogue. So we think that minimal social essentialism just holds that some social phenomena have essences and that these essences can be rigorously studied. But this minimal version of social essentialism doesn't need to be modeled after natural kind essentialism, so it doesn't hold that social, or it doesn't need to hold that social essences have to be intrinsic or microstructural. It doesn't have to hold that social essences are in all cases mind independent, or that they have to be ahistorical. And we think that this minimal version of social essentialism provides the best way to account for the need for shared definitions in the social sciences, as well as the significance of the distinction between essence and existence in social ontology. So we're happy to talk more about our response to the first objection as well as the second objection. But because we're short of time, we're going to conclude and just remind you that what we argued for here is that we think foundational social ontology is no doubt a worthy endeavor, but its success crucially depends on an accurate description of its explananda. And we think that social ontology as a whole would really benefit from a greater emphasis on the descriptive project. We're looking forward to hearing your feedback, and thank you very much for listening to our presentation. Bye.